We've been really busy this session, I will say that. We've been renewing our Observer Corps and Lobby Corps program, which is really great. Many of you that are on here I can see are involved with that program, so that's really great. If you know others who would be interested in doing state level advocacy at the legislature, please encourage them to get in contact with me at the state level. As a reminder to local league members, state legislative advocacy does have to go through the state league. So you do need to get in contact with me before you do actually commence anything. That is great. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to walk through the issues that we've been watching this session, and just give quick summaries about what's happened and then where those issues or laws or provisions, those bills, ended up, which most of them ended up in the same place, which was nowhere, but we'll talk about that as we go through. So let's get ahead and get started. One of the first things that we were paying attention to and watching this session was the Legislative Auditor's report on voter registration in Minnesota. So the Legislative Auditor is a nonpartisan division of the legislature. It is controlled and directed by a bipartisan, bicameral commission of the legislature that directs it to evaluate and audit certain programs of the state. So that might be, sometimes it's, sometimes they're doing literal like financial type audits. Sometimes they're mostly, evaluating certain programs and how money is being spent on a certain program. And other times they're just evaluating for efficiency and whether or not an agency is meeting its duties under the law. So the Legislative Auditor report this time was about the voter registration system in Minnesota. Overall, the voter registration report in Minnesota was really good. Lots of great recommendations came out of it. We're really excited about the report. One thing that we were watching for and knew was coming, and we were concerned about, was that there were some discrepancies that ineligible persons may have voted in the 2016 election, but the report did say that primarily this was due to confusion over whether or not an individual who is convicted of a felony can vote. So here in Minnesota, if you are convicted of a felony, you cannot vote until you have completed your sentence for that conviction. That includes not only being imprisoned, but also if you are still serving probation, parole, or supervised release. And that causes some confusion because some people are on probation or on supervised release and they don't realize that they are not yet allowed to vote. Or and that confusion can go through, can come not only from the individuals, but the state has never really made a proactive effort to make that clear to people. And sometimes there's even confusion by election judges. And if you want to read the details of the report, there are even circumstances where the court system doesn't really know whether or not the individual is eligible or not to vote at a given time. So depending on the circumstances. So they pointed out, so the report does point out that there are some discrepancies. The good news is that the discrepancies were a very, 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 very small number. So really not a lot to be concerned about. Obviously, we want to improve the system as much as we can, but our system is really good, is what the report found. It did make several recommendations to modernize the statewide voter registration system, and that's essentially the statewide voter registration system, or the SVRS, is the database system that essentially all of our voter registration goes into. So anytime a person registers to vote, that information gets entered into the SVRS, and then when the counties or the election judges receive a poll book, that information is what comes out of the SVRS. So it's kind of the main place for who the voters are and where they live. So the report recommended that system is modernized because it was created in 2002 and really hasn't received any substantial updates since then, despite the fact that it's been asked to do more So they're going to modernize that system, hopefully. One of the best things about the voter registration report, there was no suggestion to implement provisional ballots or end same-day registration here in Minnesota, which is really great. We were really afraid that that might be one of the recommendations, and that was not the case. So we're really excited that that was not brought up. On that note, we were watching for provisional ballots overall here in Minnesota because provisional ballots had appeared in a bill last year, and it is a priority of Senator Kiffmeyer, who is the chair of the Senate Elections Committee. So we were watching for that. We figured that between the fact that it is a priority of Senator Kiffmeyer, it did appear in a bill last year, and it is a and because it relates to voting and voter registration elections, we kind of figured that that would be a perfect storm for that issue to come up again and for that bill to be proposed again, but it did not get proposed again, not proactively. So no news is good news there. So that did not come out of that. Related to the audit report again, we have also been watching the Restore the Vote movement. That's sometimes called felony reenfranchisement. So again, the current law prohibits that individuals with felony convictions from voting before their sentence is complete. And again, that includes probation, parole, and supervised release. The Restore the Vote bill would have allowed individuals to vote so long as they are not imprisoned, even if they're still serving their sentence. So that means essentially that individuals who are on probation or parole or supervised release may vote in an election. That bill did receive a hearing in the House Public Safety Committee, but it failed on an 8-7 vote. With Representative Zerwas as the sole Republican in favor of the bill. The bill does have bipartisan support in both chambers of the legislature, so we are looking forward to this being introduced again next session and working with the legislature on a bipartisan basis to get this passed. And of course, we are continuing to work with the Restore the Vote Coalition on this issue. Do we have any questions from any of the callers? I don't see any questions in the chat box, but if you do have questions, now is a good time to ask. Okay, no questions so far, but feel free to enter in the chat box if you do have questions. So we have also been watching for election cybersecurity here. For those of you who are not aware, Minnesota was one of the states whose voter registration database was scanned by a foreign entity. That was confirmed by national security officials. So that's something that we've been aware of. The good news is that both parties in the legislature do agree on cybersecurity generally on principle. So we are looking forward to that bipartisan agreement. And because of that bipartisan agreement, they were making a lot of good movement towards accepting federal funding from the government to modernize the SVRS, which was one of the recommendations of the voter registration report, and also increase election cybersecurity for the database. So that was moving forward on a really great basis. We were really excited about that because there seemed to be some really, really strong bipartisan agreement there. And because the money came from the federal government, we had to spend very little money of our own on doing that work. So essentially we were getting free money to do work that we really needed. And there was bipartisan agreement. Unfortunately, the funding for election cybersecurity and modernization of the statewide voter registration system was included in the supplemental budget omnibus bill. And as we'll go over later, the supplemental budget omnibus bill was vetoed by the governor. And we'll go over more of those details in a bit here. See, a couple more people have joined. If you are joining, please feel free to use the chat box on the right side of your screen to enter any questions if you have any as I'm going through the presentation. And if you are calling in, I will occasionally stop throughout the presentation to ask for questions from callers. So we also did a lot of work on money and politics this session. There was, for example, a major campaign finance bill based on the recommendations from the Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board. The Campaign Finance Board had gone through some rulemaking process to do some clarification of statutes, and they had started a rulemaking process for that to actually write out those rules. What the legislature decided is that they wanted those rules to be put into statute and approved by the legislature rather than just being issued as rules from the board, which is really good because mostly what that does is, that adds clarity to the statutes and adds clarity to the law so people know how to follow the law. And then it also gives extra weight to those rules. When they become statutes, they have extra weight and can be more likely to be enforced in an effective manner. So it was really good to have a campaign finance bill. There were a couple of changes from the recommendations of the board, but the parties agreed on those recommendations. And while they were not always ideal, they were reasonable. So there were a couple changes, nothing super terrible. There was one change, however, that the League did actively oppose and work on. So for background, coordinated expenditures, or sometimes called approved expenditures, are when a spender, who can be an individual or a PAC or a super PAC, spends money at the direction or suggestion of a candidate to benefit that candidate. So the penultimate, the most simple example of a coordinated expenditure is when a candidate and a PAC get together and design and publish an advertisement together. That's like a very clear, obvious example of a coordinated expenditure. But it can include other things. So it can, for example, include if a spender and a candidate exchange any non-public information. And that's because money is typically spent in order to gather the information, compile it, analyze it, and then when it's exchanged, it is typically exchanged for the benefit of the candidate. So that is one issue that we've been watching, because one of the provisions in the campaign finance bill, one of the changes that the legislature wanted to implement, would have created an exemption to coordinated expenditures, and it would have allowed candidates to provide the names of potential donors to a spender. So what that means is essentially candidates would be giving their email lists to super PACs. That was the main concern of the League. When we discussed it with legislators in the Campaign Finance Board, the concept was that candidates were supposed to be able to give their email list to their parties so that it would be a party building activity, which is reasonable and is a logical explanation, but the specific provision in the law itself did not limit it to parties. It said any spender, and that includes PACs and super PACs. And that's what the League was really concerned about, because what that likely would have done would have increased the reliance on PACs and super PACs. So we were concerned about that, about creating a new exemption for coordinated expenditures that would have increased the reliance on money and PACs. So that did make it into the final bill, unfortunately. But again, overall, the whole campaign finance bill was a really good bill. It received bipartisan support, and it was signed by the governor ultimately. Any questions about the campaign finance bill before we move on? Okay. The legislature also attempted to pass an elections bill this session. Mostly there were technical changes in the bill. There were a few substantive changes that the League either supported or would not have opposed. For example, it did try to implement some of the recommendations from the voter registration audit report and do additional things to ensure that our voter registration databases are up to date and accurate. Most of the provisions were eventually included in one of the major omnibus bills, but as we'll be discussing later, the omnibus bills were eventually vetoed, so those did not become law. One provision that we were following and supporting actively was voter registration by state agencies. Current law already requires that state agencies offer voter registration services to members of the public and their employees. Unfortunately, however, not all state agencies are actually performing those services. So this bill would have required agencies that issue licenses, and that can be a driver's license, a hunting license, a fishing license, an occupational license. It would require those agencies to provide information on registering to vote to any individual who seeks a license. And the League showed up to support that when that bill was in the Senate Elections Committee. A modified version of that bill was inserted into one of the supplemental budget omnibus bill, and it would have applied only to the Department of Natural Resources, and essentially it would have only applied to hunting and fishing licenses and things like that. So it was included in the omnibus bill. However, that provision was removed from the omnibus bill by request of the governor. Give me just a second here, everyone. Receiving some questions about passing along information to other members. Again, for those who are coming on to the call late, there are many methods that this information will be available. This webinar is being recorded so that people can watch them at a time that is more convenient to them. This presentation will also be available as a PDF so that people can review the presentation if they want and print it. And then there also is the final issue of the Capital Letter, which is our recurring publication during the legislative session. The last issue of the Capital Letter will be coming out today. So that is another method of being able to review this information. So all of that information will be available in one form or another, and that will be made public to the whole membership. I do have a question from Marcy, who asked why the governor wanted the provision about licensing and voter registration at the DNR removed from the omnibus bill. That's a great question, Marcy. I don't know for sure. My guess would be that the bill that left the Senate Elections Committee applied to many types of licenses. Like I said, it applies to drivers, hunting, fishing, occupational, etc. Any department there are many departments that issue licenses. The version that showed up in the supplemental budget bill was limited only to the Department of Natural Resources. And I don't know for sure, but I would have to guess that it had something to do with the fact that the provision in the supplemental budget bill was more limited than what was originally proposed by the committee. And Kathy is here reminding me, and again, I did say, we are here, we did show up to support this particular bill when it was in the Senate Elections Committee. Any more questions on the voter registration issue with state agencies? Okay. So ranked choice votes. Ranked choice voting was an issue that came up at the legislature this year. There was a bill that would have prevented and prohibited any local government from implementing or using ranked choice voting. This would have caused major problems for Minneapolis and St. Paul because those cities already use ranked choice voting for their local elections. And it would have prevented and impeded other cities from adopting the ranked choice voting process, including, for example, St. Louis Park, which literally adopted it in the past couple weeks. So that bill, the League opposed that bill, and we showed up. Deb Brinkman from LWV St. Louis Park showed up since she was working on the issue with her league and with Fair Vote Minnesota. The bill was very unpopular. There was only one testifier in favor of the bill, and it was the individual who had requested that Senator Kiffmeyer author the bill, or I'm sorry, Senator Kiffmeyer did not author that bill. It was not the primary author. I can't remember who the primary author was off the top of my head right now, but there was only one testifier who favored the bill. There were several opposing testifiers, including the League of Minnesota and other large names, such as the Secretary of State and the League of Minnesota Cities. So it was a pretty unpopular bill. The bill did not meet one of the legislative deadlines, and so it never made it past that one hearing. So it essentially died after it had that committee hearing. Any questions on the ranked choice vote? I don't know whether this will come back in the future, but I know that it does not have bipartisan support. So. We also covered campaign public subsidies. So here in Minnesota, we have our tax checkoff program, which allows voters to check a box on a tax form to designate $5 to a political party or a special fund. That money is then redistributed to candidates of that party, or if the special fund was selected, to all candidates equally. Candidates who receive that money must agree not to spend more than a certain limit. So one bill would have changed this program so that you could not designate a specific party, you could only designate the special fund. Now, when we first looked at this bill, the League did not oppose that because our positions only discuss providing campaign subsidies. We do support public campaign subsidies, but we support public campaign subsidies for candidates. We don't we don't speak about the parties necessarily in that position, and as a nonpartisan organization, we do not support or oppose any particular political party. So we did not have a problem with that provision on principle. However, the practical effect and impact is that not many people actually designate money to the special fund that goes to all candidates. So there would have been very little money in the program if this bill went forward. And because there would be so little money available for the program, it would have been ineffective and essentially killed it because no legislator or no candidate would have participated in the program. So even though we did not oppose this change in principle, the impact of it was problematic for us because it essentially would have killed off the public campaign subsidy program, and we did not want that to happen. Eventually, this provision was removed from the Omnibus bill after lobbying by the League of Women Voters Minnesota, Clean Elections Minnesota, and Common Cause Minnesota. So we're really glad that that happened. Redistricting was also an issue this session. Redistricting was a little weird because there were some redistricting provisions that were included in some bills. Weirdly enough, they did not actually go through the Elections Committee, despite being in that committee's jurisdiction. Instead, the redistricting provisions were placed into the State Government Finance Committee bill from the House of Representatives. Essentially, what the redistricting provisions would have done is it would have kept redistricting in the control of the legislature, and it would have implemented several redistricting provisions. Most of the provisions were not harmful, but they were not in the ranking that the League would prefer. There was also some missing provisions. So for example, the biggest one, the major one that the League was really concerned about was there was no prohibition on partisan candidate or incumbent gerrymandering. So that was kind of a glaring omission that the League really had concerns about and were working against. And we issued an action alert on this. It eventually was removed from the Omnibus bill after lobbying by the League and Common Cause. Rather than fixing the provisions that existed, they just removed them altogether. So nothing passed related to redistricting this year. We also were watching campaign finance rulemaking this year. One provision of the House's version of the supplemental budget bill would have prohibited the campaign finance bill from issuing interpretive rules. So this particular provision, that authority to create and implement interpretive rules is important because that's one of the biggest jobs of the Campaign Finance Board. Their duty is to clarify statutes and enforce the law. So removing the ability for them to issue interpretive rules really disables them from doing their job. So the League showed up to oppose that provision. We sent action alerts about that as well. And eventually that was removed from the Omnibus bill in conference committee after lobbying by the League, Clean Elections Minnesota, and Common Cause. More campaign finance stuff. The political contribution refund program also was under fire this year again. The political contribution refund program, for anyone who doesn't know, allows a voter to donate up to $50 to a candidate. The voter can then receive a refund from the state. So it's essentially kind of like a small temporary loan. What this does and why the league supports it is because it increases a broad base of donor participation and it decreases the reliance on big donors and special interest money. We sent out a couple action alert, well, at least one action alert on this issue as well, because one provision in the House version of the tax omnibus bill would have repealed and defunded the political contribution refund program. Thankfully, that provision was removed during conference committee. So an overview of session, what is typical of what happens during session is that the legislature will bundle several small bills into a few larger bills. So they'll bundle lots of bills into one state government finance omnibus bill. They'll gather up a lot of bills related to environment and package that into a environment omnibus bill. That practice isn't always super transparent, but it is typical. This year, however, they took it one step further. They created a monster bill. It received many nicknames. It received some people were calling it the Megabus bill. Some people called it the Omnibus Prime bill. The official name was the Supplemental Budget bill, Omnibus bill, despite the fact that not all the provisions in the bill had anything to do with a budget. But what they did is the legislature essentially took many of the omnibus bills, which were already large enough as it was, and combined them into a gigantic singular omnibus bill, kind of a Frankenstein of monster of all the bills. And that bill ended up being 990 pages. That ended up being the main carry bill for all the legislature, almost all the legislators worked this session. Rather than passing several small bills, they passed a couple of standalone bills, and then this, and then like the pensions bill was a standalone bill. There also was the bonding bill was a standalone bill. The tax omnibus bill was a standalone bill, and that was fairly large on its own. And then there was this supplemental budget bill, this Megabus bill, that was huge. And that was pretty much almost everything else the legislature was working on this session. So what happened in the last couple of days of session is that the conference committees were in a mad rush to complete the bills on time and to package them into an omnibus, this gigantic omnibus bill. The governor in the last couple of days of session alleged a lack of negotiation with him from the legislature, and he released 117 objections to the supplemental budget bill in the last week of session. The governor also indicated that he wanted some additions to the budget bill, including, for example, emergency funding for schools. So the legislature continued to work into the late night hours and continued to work over the weekend in conference committee to try and make some changes based off of the governor's objections. They did not accept all of the governor's objections and suggestions, but did work to make some changes happen. Eventually, the conference committees did agree on some supplemental budget bill and the tax omnibus bill. Those passed out of this legislature, signed on by both the Senate and the House. But once they reached the governor, both bills were vetoed by the governor. So a large portion of the work that the legislature did this session ended up being vetoed by the governor. Any questions on the last couple days of session and the omnibus bill? Ellen asks whether we have a position on omnibus bills and are they good or bad for democracy? That's a great question, Ellen. So omnibus bill, the league does not have a position directly on omnibus bills. However, we do have a position on transparency and government and participation in governance. And omnibus bills are definitely a practice that reduces transparency and prevent good representative government and participation in government. Because omnibus bills tend to be really, really difficult to track. They tend to happen all at once by surprise almost. And they tend to happen in one large go. So rather than being able to track the different changes, there's just one giant change in a committee that will go to the conference committee, which will then package several bill, they'll go to many bills also get packaged into one giant bill. So if you're looking for a specific provision, it's difficult to find, especially when you're digging through something like this bill this year, which was 990 pages. So the omnibus bill practice can be very difficult to track for citizens, because unless you are literally there in the room and literally watching every day, it can be impossible to keep track of what's happening at the legislature and what's happening with bills. So we don't oppose omnibus bills in principle in terms of a direct position statement on that, but they do definitely have a negative effect on transparency. The League actually joined into an amicus brief in the Minnesota Supreme Court last year for a lawsuit that challenged an omnibus bill from 2015. We tried to convince the court to take a more active role in enforcing Minnesota's single subject clause, which requires that all law that pass out of the legislature only have one subject. The Supreme Court issued a unanimous decision that the bill at issue was in fact constitutional. So we do have some work to do on that front in terms of convincing the legislature to be more transparent, rely less on large omnibus bills, that kind of thing. The good news is that there was a bipartisan bill introduced that would have clarified the single subject clause of the Constitution. There would have been a constitutional amendment that would have clarified it. We have not looked directly at that language yet because that bill was not going to pass out of the legislature this year, but we plan to look on it this year. There are some big plans for the State League to work on omnibus bills and legislative transparency generally. I'm working with Britt Hegland, the advocacy chair, to figure out exactly what those plans will look like and what the project will look like and what the end result will be. So if you do have an interest in this issue, please keep an eye on All Member News, because we'll be announcing what movement we'll be taking on this issue in the near future. Great. Any other questions from anyone else before we move on? Okay. So kind of looking forward to next session. Like we talked about, there were some election law changes, some technical election law changes that were in the supplemental budget bill, as well as funding for election cybersecurity and voter registration system modernization that also was in the supplemental budget bill. Because the supplemental budget bill was vetoed, those provisions did not make it into law. So there currently is no additional funding for cybersecurity, and those technical corrections did not happen. So we'll be watching both of these issues closely in 2019 because they both tend to have bipartisan support. They both are related to elections and improving our elections process. So we're going to be watching that closely. Our main ask, we don't anticipate to have to be doing a lot of asking or convincing that this needs to happen. There tends to be bipartisan agreement that there needs to be funding for cybersecurity, especially election cybersecurity, and there tends to be bipartisan agreement that we need to continue to make technical changes to our election law to improve them. What our ask will probably be that we will ask for a standalone bill and that these are not included in an omnibus bill so that we don't have a repeat of this session. Because even though there was bipartisan agreement and they voted in favor of the bill, it was packaged with some provisions that were not bipartisan and ultimately were in a bill that got vetoed. So we're hoping to put these into a standalone bill so that they will be signed by the governor. We also plan to keep an eye on the census very close for the next couple of years and redistricting. Both census and redistricting will be very urgent in the sense that they are timely and coming up soon, and important in the sense that they have very broad impact on Minnesotans. So the census is where we count the population of Minnesota and where people live in Minnesota. That count informs redistricting, which is where we draw the maps of the legislative and congressional boundaries for where a senator or representative represents the people of Minnesota. So the census happens first, and that has to be accurate, because if we don't have an accurate census count, then our redistricting will not be reflective of where people actually live in Minnesota. Most of the census action will be happening at the federal level. The census is implemented by the Department of Commerce. It is a federal program. There is a lot of cooperation with the state and the states and local communities in order to make sure that there is an accurate count. But for the most part, the authority of the census lies with the federal government. One thing that might happen at the state level is there may be a funding supplement at the state level. We're not quite sure whether or not that will be contentious here at the state level, but we are working closely with the Census Mobilization Partnership and staying up to date with their information to make sure that we're aware of how it's happening at the federal level. And of course, we again will be watching redistricting next session as well. After the census happens in 2020 and 2021, redistricting will happen in 2021 and 2022. So that happens purely at the state level, and it's guaranteed to be a big fight. It's a big fight every year, and it will definitely be a big fight or every 10 years. And it's guaranteed to be a big fight this upcoming time as well. Because whoever controls the map can make sure that the maps are drawn in such a way to either be reflective and representative of Minnesotans, or can gerrymander the maps to be advantaging a particular group of people or a particular party. So we'll be watching two types of bills. The first will be principles, which is what criteria is used to draw the maps. So for example, one principle that's pretty obvious and people tend to agree on is that the maps are contiguous, that a district is all connected with each other, that it's all one big district rather than being split up in different places. We'll also be watching for method bills, which is who draws the maps and how they draw the map. So here in Minnesota, the legislature draws the map, and the legislature approves the maps and sends it to the governor to either sign or veto. There are other states that use other methods such as an independent commission. Sometimes that is a citizens commission. And Minnesota will be working closely with Common Cause Minnesota on our redistricting work in the upcoming session, since that will be a important issue. So that's what's coming up next session, most likely. So that's the end of the presentation. I can definitely take questions here now if people would like. As a reminder, in case anyone came on late, this recording will be available for replay. We'll make that available to all members in Minnesota. So it will be available for replay if people want to watch it at their convenience. I also will be making this presentation available in a PDF form so people can print them at home. And then please also remember that we do have the capital letter. The last issue of the capital letter this year will be coming out later today. And that will also have more details than was given here in this presentation. So are there any questions from anyone before we end the webinar today? Okay, I don't think I see any additional questions. I do have a question from Ellen about suggestions for meeting with your legislators during off session to lay groundwork. So we probably won't be doing official league lobbying with members during the off session, but obviously, members are welcome to contact their legislators in their individual capacity at any time. And so they're allowed to do that and keep up to date with their legislators and just remind them, this is an important issue. I care about it. This is the result that I want, whatever it is. I do want to point out that there is an election this this fall, and the entire state legislative house is up for election. So there will likely be a lot of different people in the legislature. So if you go and lobby your legislator today, they might not be in office next session. So just keep that in mind, that not all of those people will actually be there next session. So yeah, so that's part of the reason that we're not actively working with legislators this summer and this fall, is because some of them might be replaced. But we are laying the groundwork for other stuff. So, any other questions from anyone? Kathy asks if there's any plans for the league to be actively involved in the census. Local leagues were asked to promote the census at the local level. Will we do that again? Yes. So we have, last year, we did recruit a limited number of local leagues to contact their local governments to participate in what's called the LUCA, the Local Update of Census Addresses. Not all local leagues participated in that because many local communities, like the cities and counties, already had participated in that program, were already signed up to do it. We reached out to a couple of limited local leagues to ask them to contact their local cities or counties to ask their counties and cities to participate in the LUCA program. The LUCA program ensures that the Department of Commerce has all the new addresses that have been created over the last 10 years. So when an apartment building gets built or a new house gets built, the local community, the local city knows about it, but the Department of Commerce at the federal level doesn't always know about it. The LUCA program is how the local municipality lets the federal government know that there's a new address there. So we asked some local leagues to participate in encouraging their local governments to participate in the LUCA program. We will be asking local leagues to do education on census. There is obviously most of the census work happens in 2020. So at 2019 and 2020. So there probably won't be a whole lot of census work to be doing in the very near future, but we do anticipate that that local leagues will have opportunities to participate in census activity and encouraging and educating members of the public to be with the census. Like I said, we are working very closely with the Census Mobilization Partnership to link into what other organizations are doing with the census so that we don't duplicate work and that we don't, that we're all helping each other. For example, the Mobilization Census Partnership is working very closely with a communications consultant to figure out what is the right messaging to ensure that people feel safe and comfortable responding to the census survey question. So we are working on that. There just won't be anything for local leagues to actively engage in the very near future. But I will definitely be sending that information out. Either it will be distributed through the president's call or it will be distributed in all member news, any updates on how to participate with the census. Any other questions before we end today? Joanne asks if we would be interested in furnishing questions to candidate forums. No, and the reason we don't do that is because it is both league policy and required by IRS regulations that we do not mix our advocacy and our voter service activities. So we will not be recommending that any specific questions be submitted at candidate forums. That's why our voter service policy is that voter service questions for our candidate forums come from the audience and for the most part. So we will not be recommending that any priorities or questions be given to priority to any league positions. We want to make sure that we're keeping our advocacy and our voter service very, very separate. And we're trying to be really strict about that because failing to do that means that the league receives a perception of partisanship, and we don't want that because that really prevents us from executing our mission effectively. We will, however, once elections are done, be issuing recommended questions for legislative interviews, and that will simply be a information gathering session so that people can talk to their legislators and learn what their legislators, how legislators feel about certain policies or proposals to changes in law. But that won't happen until after the election is completed and those new legislators are selected by the election. Any more questions? Okay, if there is no other questions, we're going to go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you everyone for attending. Again, this information will be sent out, a link to the recording as well as will be coming out shortly. And there also will be the PDF of this slideshow and the capital letter as well. So please keep an eye out for those if you're interested in distributing this to other members. So thank you so much for your time today, everyone. If you have any questions that you think of later, feel free to email me. My email is nharper@lwvmn.org. Again, that's nharper, Harper, @lwvmn.org. Thanks, everyone.